This is your last chance. After this, there is no going back. You take the blue pill, and the story ends. You wake up in your bed, and you believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Without saying it, I know you know what movie this is from. At this point, it seems like it's across half of YouTube. Take the red pill, don't be blue-pilled, step out of the matrix. Some form of this is everywhere. But what happens when you take too many red pills? When you embody the surface level ideas of the matrix too much? What happens when you overdose? So let's look into it. Similar to my last video on the Matrix, I'm going to be going into some of the ways where the themes or the surface level ideas can be twisted and used in a way that wasn't necessarily intended, but that normal people or just your average moviegoer, average person on YouTube has just passively absorbed. We're going to talk about things like the trap of the Messiah, the double life issue, and how the villain may be the secret hero. First, before I get into all of that, I do want to say, I love The Matrix. I know I said this in the last video, but I don't want this to be taken like it's some anti-version of The Matrix. Like, I hate The Matrix or something like that. Actually, I think The Matrix is a lot smarter than people give it credit for. I think it's actually much deeper than a lot of passive people have just absorbed. I think another great example, which is something I've used in the past when I was talking about this last video, I talked about some of these examples. But one I didn't use was the movie Cuties. This kind of illustrates what I'm talking about here. And that is the movie, when you actually watch the movie Cuties on Netflix, and I don't necessarily recommend it, because it's a very controversial movie and it's really not that great. But the whole point of it was that, sadly, young women, or young girls in this case, are totally misused by Western culture and sexualized in a way that's perverted and against traditional culture. Now that was the idea, and a lot of people disliked it. That's why it was a big controversy on Netflix, and people were against it. But a lot of the reasons why people were against it is what was interesting. They were against it because they believed that the message of the movie was to sexualize young girls. That's what they believed. When in actuality, they were trying to say the opposite. Now, you might still dislike Cuties. You might think that it's not worth it. Even if that's an important point, it's not worth sexualizing them in the process, which I understand. That's a perfectly fine opinion to have. However, a lot of people thought that it was the opposite. They thought that was actually the point. The point was the sexualizing. That's what they were trying to do. And they missed it altogether. And that's because so often when people watch things, they watch things not for the deeper meaning, not for the criticality, trying to understand what the person is actually trying to say, what the filmmakers mean. Instead, they watch it for the explosions, or the hot chick, or the good-looking guy, or some cool new meme that's out, or everyone's going to see it. They don't see it for something deeper. And I'm afraid when you go into watching something with that mindset, you often end up absorbing the worst parts of it, the parts that are not intended, and the parts that can often be destructive. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. The first point I want to talk about is the loneliness of the double life. What do I mean by that? Well, Neo sets up in the very beginning of the movie, and it's kind of ironic because this is my second part of talking about the Matrix. But in the beginning of the movie, there's this whole idea that there's two separate Neos, or two separate people. That's Thomas A. Anderson, and then there's Neo. These two separate identities. One is online and is hacking and doing all these terrible things, while the other one, on the other hand, is just a normal person who works an office job. And why is this important? Because it shows almost the origin or the popularizing of this concept we see all the time, and that is we can be anonymous online. We can be, in some respects, more ourselves. And we'll get into how this is the case. We can be more of who we are. We can be more into whatever niche that we want to be in. We can totally obsess over crocheting, for instance. But we can totally obsess about whatever small little side hustle we want to do. While simultaneously, though, we also can have our worst impulses without any check, without anyone to stop us, because we don't have someone judging us over our shoulder. We don't have a friend who's going to look at us and be like, what are you doing? Who's going to call you out, because no one really knows. And so while in some respects we can be more of who we want to be, in other respects we end up being the worst version of ourselves when we're online. But there's this great quote that I'm gonna give now that Agent Smith says that kind of sums up this idea really well. And he says, "It seems that you have been living two lives. In one life, you were Thomas A. Anderson, a program writer for a respectable software company. You have a social security number, you pay your taxes, and you help your landlady carry out the garbage. The other life is in computers, where you go by the hacker alias Neo, and are guilty of virtually every computer crime we have a law for. In 2004, Professor John Suler, published an article in Rider University. And give me a second, I'm going to read some excerpts here. It was entitled The Online Disinhibition Effect. So what is that? Well, the disinhibition effect describes a loosening of social restrictions and inhibitions that are normally present in face-to-face interactions that take place in interactions on the internet. So why is this important? Well, like I was talking about before, this kind of separates into two separate ones. And he calls this benign disinhibition and toxic disinhibition. Benign disinhibition is when you feel more free to disclose things about yourself that you wouldn't necessarily tell, that you feel a little bit more free to be yourself, to focus on the things that you're more interested in. And there's this new level of freedom, and he calls that benign disinhibition, because the things that are stopping your inhibitions are not there any longer, because you're at a place where you don't have the structures of face-to-face contact. And that can be a positive thing, like we talked about before. But on the negative side, there's toxic disinhibition. And what is that? Toxic disinhibition is the anonymous troll. The anonymous troll who goes on there and he doesn't care. Why? Because there's no one else to stop him. There are no inhibitions. There's no one to say, you need to stop. There's no one who's going to ostracize him from his job or from his friendship group. And because of that, there's much more freedom to be an asshole online, to say whatever you want to say, to be the worst version of yourself, to allow the first thing that comes in your mind to be broadcasted out to everyone. And this is sadly where something like the Matrix has led to, or these kind of surface level ideas. Because when you popularize or you look at Neo, and by the way, when you actually think about the movie, he becomes more of his full self, more of his savior self, more of the actual Neo as he goes on. But the movie, when looked at from a surface level standpoint, still popularizes this idea of having two split identities, which leads to some toxic effects long term. Because even if you can be more yourself, which is a good thing, simultaneously that toxic behavior will pull you down. And if it starts to become mingled with the kind of persona you think you are, you're more likely to self-disclose, the benign disinhibition. You're more likely to be yourself, say what you like and dislike, and at the same time, you're also more likely to be toxic. Those things can meld together, blend together, until who you think you are, your full version of yourself, your whole self, ends up being much more toxic. Because when you're more yourself online, it's also mingled with that toxicity. So this positive thing also comes with its negative part too. And that's where I have to be totally honest. I am just as guilty of this as anyone else. And I hope less of the toxic part, but definitely of the benign disinhibition, of thinking, being more likely to self-disclose and focus on what you want to and what's important to you. This channel is a great example of that. And I think we fall into the other part of this is this loneliness, this feeling of, well, you can't really be your full self out with everyone else. And so the only place you can go to is the internet. The only place you can go to is where all of your favorite things are, where your interests lie. And in those places you can find some level of community, but that drives this wedge between you and your friends and your social circle. And like I said, I think a lot of Gen Z is guilty of this, but somewhat not necessarily our fault. I mean, what choice do we have? We're presented with something that is a huge opportunity, but this is the pitfall. The pitfall is this kind of striking down the middle, this bisection of us having two lives, the one in front of everyone and the one behind the scenes. And both have aspects of who we are, some more than others depending on the person, but both have aspects. And when you feel like you can't be your full self with people and you're cut between, it can make you even more lonely and drive this feeling of isolation. Like, forget even the toxic part. Just the benign disinhibition, just disclosing more and feeling like you're more interested in the things online, just makes this separation between who you are in real life, who you are online, and feeling like you can't square the two and you don't have those connections. The next thing I want to talk about is what I will call the savior snare. And that's how we often feel because of the online world and this hyper-individualism. And I'll go into some specifics of what I mean. But we often feel like we are too too special, too exceptional. And when I say exceptional, I don't necessarily mean like we're so great. I mean that we're exceptions to the rule, that everyone else acts a certain way, but not me. I'm the main character. This is where we get into this main character syndrome. And I think one of the big reasons this is the case is things like Neo. You got Neo, Harry Potter, Star Wars, you got all these like savior stories. But furthermore, not just that, the technology that is so much a part of the Matrix, that's so much a part of our modern lives, has this individualizing appeal to it, this individualizing push. And that is, for instance, we have our phone. And what is a phone? It's this singular device shining on one person, our own little portal to a whole world. And on and on and on, you can see this. Inside that portal are apps, and those apps all filter towards specifically you. And on those apps, you got feeds. Those feeds, once again, are filtered exactly to you. And so as we've matured in this society, as we've grown up, more and more is just filtered to exactly us. And it gives us this feeling of that everyone else is an NPC. And I talked about this a little bit in my last video, of how often the people who twist the Matrix and the ideas in it, they take blue-pilled people, normies as they call it, like all these slang terms for people who are just normal, everyday people, and they demonize them. They make them out to be the enemy. They call them blue pillars and NPCs. But one part that I didn't really hit on too much that I want to hit on here is that along with this individualism, along with this savior complex and this main character syndrome, is this feeling like everyone else is an NPC. They're kind of living in our video game, that they're just kind of guests, that they're along for the ride. They're second characters. And the problem with that is that it can often give us a very distorted reality. It can lead us to a lot of really big biases in ways that totally cloud our perception of the world, of events, of the people around us. I'll give you a couple examples. First, there's the fundamental attribution error. And all that is to say is that we are disproportionately likely to attribute bad things that happen to people to them, to who they are, to what they do. Whereas in us ourselves, this is called the actor-observer asymmetry. Us ourselves, we tend to think, well, it's not really us. It was something outside of us. It was something else. So if we're late, this is the classic example. If we're late, well, so many bad things happened to us that day. We had this happen and that happened. We went to brush our teeth, but then we have an electric toothbrush and we had to replace it, and so that made this. And we tend to blame all of the events for what happened and not who we are. We're not late people. We're actually punctual people. We wanted to be there on time. We just couldn't. And other people, on the other hand, they get the NPC treatment. They are that kind of thing. They are late people. They are bad people. They are liars. They didn't just fib accidentally. They didn't just say something they didn't mean. They are liars. They are distorters of the truth. That's who they are. And that's where we get in this like hyper-individualized, savior complex exceptionality. This feeling of we're special. We kind of see things a unique way. Other people, they might look at the news and they get the confirmation bias and they see what they want to see, but we can see what's real. And that's where it also coincides with that skepticism of the Matrix. The Matrix, sadly, all of the main characters have this mentality to them. And I mentioned in the last video when I talked about how they look at the people around them and they say, oh, well, if they're a part of the Matrix, they're our enemy. It's this implicit notion that we have what it takes to understand reality, that we have what it takes on our own to understand how things truly are, to see, oh, well, that's wrong and that's wrong. And I'm not saying that we can't do that, but to believe that it's second nature and that other people can't, and they're just sheep going about their business, while we, on the other hand, we're the exceptional ones. That is one of the distorted views, the distorted perceptions from the Matrix that I think has been really poorly taken. Because the truth is, we're like everyone else. We are subject to the same biases. We are just as likely to be the kind of person who's late as we are the type of person to just be late on accident. That's who we are. And when we act, whether it's those outside things like the algorithm making us feel like we're the center of attention and we're exceptional and everything is individualized to us, or whether it's just inside of our heads. It's our own perception of things, that our own biases that cloud ourselves. Either way, we have to remember that we're like everyone else. And that's not to say that we're not special, because we have unique aspects to us. But when it comes to understanding the world, when it comes to seeing things clearly, we are subject to the same issues, the same pitfalls as everyone else. Now, my last point is probably going to be the most controversial. And that's the question, what if the villain was right? Now, I don't mean the evil robots. I mean Cypher. Cypher, who's seen as the Judas Iscariot, as the great betrayer of Trinity, of Morpheus, of Neo, that he might actually have a good idea. Now, let me explain myself. Obviously, I don't mean the betrayal. That was a bad idea. But the blue pill part is what I want to talk about here. How maybe that going with the blue pill and not the red pill was actually the right idea after all. So let's first talk about why would that even be the case. Let me ask a question. Is it really so terrible for someone to want a life where you're not constantly questioning everything, where you're not in some giant struggle that's good versus evil, where you're not in this rebellious, constant hard work? Is that really so bad? Now, you might think to yourself when I say that as, well, the quest of everyone is to try to come to the truth. Aren't we all trying to understand? Shouldn't we all have a work ethic? And let me ask you this. What are the most meaningful things that have happened to you? What are the things that matter the most to you? Now, yes, some of those will be because of hard work. That's very true. But some of them might also be very easy things, very simple things. It might be the time that you went with your girlfriend to the movies. It might be the time that you and your mom connected over a lunch. It might be the time that you and your dad, or you and your sister, or you and your best friend. But a lot of those things are not hard. They're not things that you had to slave over in order to accomplish. But they're the easy things, the simple things, the sweet things. And too often, I think the Matrix really perpetuates this idea, at least on the surface. Too often we have this glorification of hard work for hard work's sake, just because it is hard, just because it is not easy. We tend to think, oh, well, then it's worth doing. And is it such a bad idea that someone might want to enjoy their life? And I'm not talking about endless hedonism, and I think they kind of hint at that Cypher wanted endless hedonism. But pleasure isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily bad for you to enjoy a good glass of wine. It's not necessarily bad for you to play a good video game. That's not necessarily bad. However, at the same time, I'm not necessarily talking just about hedonism, just about like endless pleasure. But I'm also talking about the easy things that are meaningful. The connections that we have, the relationships that we have. Too much of the surface level ideas of the Matrix is about this struggle against the bad guy, the struggle against the people behind the scenes, and trying to unravel their secret conspiracies of fighting this big epic back and forth. And we like to see ourselves that way, don't we? We like to see ourselves as a soldier for the good side, as trying to make a difference in people's lives, and doing that in the best way we can. Greg McKeown, and I might have butchered that name, talks about in his book Effortless, how there is this stigma in our society against things being effortless, easy, simple. We have this want almost, this need for things to be hard, because then it's an accomplishment. Then we can have meaning and purpose in what we're doing if it's hard. But that's not necessarily the case for the things that are the most meaningful, that are the most purposeful. There are many things that are that way, but aren't necessarily hard. And he attributes that to things like the Puritan work ethic and this kind of grind-set success culture. And sadly, the Matrix, at least on the surface once again, that plays into it. It plays into this kind of struggle, that in order to be successful or to do the right thing, you have to kind of struggle with your friends against the enemy, against the bad guys. And it's not necessarily fun, it's kind of grimy, but there's this sort of romance about it, because you're working hard as the underdog against these big terrible machines, against the Matrix, the system. So the first part of my point that's in favor of Cypher, in favor of kind of taking the blue pill in this case, is that the meaningful things, the things we're going to remember, aren't necessarily hard. They don't necessarily take a ton of effort. And sometimes they are pleasurable, and they are important for us to have. And just going after the things that are difficult, that make you the underdog, doesn't necessarily mean that's the right thing for you to do. Sometimes that's just the easiest thing for you to think of, to conceptualize, to tell yourself. Sometimes it's more about the story than the reality. But even if, let's say you believe that, and you kind of take that into account, you say, well, they were fighting against the big bad enemy. Of course they had to. They were fighting against the robots. Well, this is where I get into my next point, where we're talking about the surface level details. That's the point. But even if that was the case, and we take, okay, well, a surface level person might still think he's still bad because he wasn't fighting against the evil robots. Okay, let's take that into account. But let me ask the obvious kind of, high-end weed question, and that is, what if it was all Matrix? What if it all wasn't real? What if even the struggle, humans versus the machines, wasn't real at all, and there was something even below that? And then what if there was something below that, and below that, and below that? And then we get into this infinite regress of questions. And that's the next point. The next point is when we live in this, when we internalize these ideas and live in this mindset, it ends up just becoming endless skepticism, endless questions for no reason. And it leaves us, once again, in this low, and I hit on this a little bit in my last video, in this low, drained, negative, sad state where everything has to be torn down. Nothing can be good, right? Everything has to be corrupt. We have to debunk everything. Any celebrity that might be worth something, they have to be torn down. There has to be some scandal about them. Every YouTuber we like, there must be some debunking or what this person has done wrong. Everything has to have its negative. And when we live in that, when we internalize those ideas, we end up making our lives so much worse. So much worse than when we would have just been naive, when we would have taken the blue pill, when we would have acted more like Cypher and just gone along with it, because we could have savored the connections I talk about in kind of my first part of this. We could have savored those connections, those easy, pleasurable, but important times we have with our loved ones, with our friends, the memories that would last. We could have savored those because we're not tearing them down with skepticism, because we're not tearing them down with questions and with useless cynicism nonstop. And sadly, I think that is one of the negative aspects of the surface level ideas in the Matrix, that it's taught so many people, particularly young men, that kind of see the negative side in everything, to constantly question. And questioning is not necessarily bad, but it isn't good either. And when we take it too far to the extreme, we don't have anything to hang our hat on, anything to build a foundation to believe in, to take pride and joy in. And that's why maybe being a blue-pilled person is better than being a red-pilled one, if that's what it takes, if it ends up degrading all these things and dragging so much down. And I think our culture, sadly, especially online culture, has internalized too much of this red pill cynicism, this red pill questioning and tearing things down. And if we had a little more of that Cypher blue pilled, if we actually enjoyed ourselves more, maybe a little more pleasure, not hedonism, but a little more pleasure, and if we focused more on the things that were more effortless, more easy, but that were important, like the connection we have with other people, like our connection with our family and friends, that we would be in a lot better circumstance than if we had followed this neo-red pill surface level matrix idea. Not only are these all reasons why everyone watching this, and just people in general, should watch their media more critically, try to understand the deeper meanings and not just the surface level ideas, but furthermore, I hope this goes into some questioning the questions, some undermining of the skepticism, some building up of maybe more connections, more of the important, meaningful things that are enjoyable, and not just the things that are hard or make us feel like we're some great part of the narratives, some great hero of our story, a savior, like I talked about earlier. I hope this does a good job of kind of building towards that, because I think it's a healthier place for myself, because I know I've fallen into these traps a great deal. But it's a better place for me, but I think it's a better place for everyone. If we can try to at least tune ourselves a little bit more towards that middle. There are definitely a lot of people who mindlessly follow, but too often, at least in the online world, and among Gen Z and young men, we tend to mindlessly question. And maybe if we can bring that over, maybe more of a purple pill, we'll all be better off for it. So that was a look into how the Matrix and some of those surface level ideas that a lot of people are passively allowed to influence them, have influenced them for the negative, and some ideas that I hope will help to influence people positively. So thanks for looking into it, and I'll see you in the next one.